Child Labor During the Industrial Revolution by Alicia Radke. During the Industrial Revolution, many families who lived in rural areas moved to urban cities in hope of finding better lives and a chance to find work which would provide income. Most jobs that the people who moved to these cities found were jobs that required long hours of work and provided very little pay, which was not enough to keep families above the poverty level. So, in order to try and stay above the poverty level, everyone in a family was required to work, and this included children who were as young as 3 years old. Work conditions were not suitable at all for children, and some of the work days that they endured lasted from anywhere around 10 to 14 hours with little to no breaks, and if there was a break at all, it would only be for an hour or shorter depending on the owner. Many of the workplaces that children worked in were dangerous and resulted in injuries or sometimes even deaths. The workplaces such as factories contained toxic fumes which were very detrimental to children's health when they were inhaled. Children in the factories that were too young to operate machines would work as assistants to textile workers. If owners thought that children were not working hard enough, they would be given harsh punishments such as beatings. Most orphans found work at factories as they were provided a place to eat and sleep, but factory owners worked them like slaves. A child's small size was seen as an advantage to factory owners who employed children. This was because they could work in small spaces, including mines and other areas, which some adults couldn't fit or work in. Children would also work for, and evidently were paid, less than adults. Children were seen as easier to manage and keep track of, and it was difficult for them to organize unions. Children who worked in rural lands didn't have much of better work lives than those who worked in cities. Children would do work such as harvesting crops for long periods of time in extreme temperatures, rain or shine. The children who worked on farms carried heavy weight in tools and produce, and they sometimes carried even more than their body mass, not to mention that the farm tools they handled were dangerous, and work in farms was much less regulated than in factories, so the use of machinery was unpredictable and dangerous. Education during the Industrial Revolution was a privilege that not many children were fortunate enough to receive. Children who worked all day had no time to receive an education, and this was because in most families everyone was required to work. Most parents did not allow their children to receive an education because their families needed them to work as much as they could to receive another income. Children who were allowed to get an education went for only portions of the day or went for a few days or weeks at a time, but after they were done, they were required to go right back to working, so their education was put to no use. Finally, after many years of the use of child labor, people began to work against it. Starting around the beginning of the 1900s, the United States worked towards the total elimination of child labor, or at least getting some restrictions on it in the workplace. In 1904, a National Child Labor Committee was established, and following suit, other states began to form child labor committees also. These types of organizations used items such as photographs, pamphlets, and leaflets to reach the public's attention. They also sent out mass mailings and investigated workplaces where the use of child labor happened. Between 1902 and 1915, many laws were established that restricted child labor or made changes to it. As industrialization matured, over time, the government stepped in and started to put an end to it. Finally, the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 stepped in and set a national minimum wage, hour standards, and outlawed the employment of children under 16 years.
Been on the brink of another disaster. The first night I lit candles, he sent for his children to come home, which they did. Afterwards, he and I had a considerable of a warm debate. Now, the letter was the telephone of its day, the primary means of communication over distance. And this letter from Samuel Slater shows his annoyance with a parent named Benchley, who kept his children from working in the mill even after Slater had lit extra candles so they could see in the dark. Yes, children worked hard at Slater and at other mills throughout New England. They also worked on farms and in craft shops, just about everywhere. Few children had the luxury of going to school full-time, and working in the mills at least meant a decent place to eat and sleep. Slater appreciated his younger workers. What he complained about were their overly protective parents and the fickle adult workers who were constantly leaving him to work in other mills. He was also unhappy about his personal fortune.